Hi everyone, I'm Josh. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the worst books of 2024, or rather the worst and the most disappointing. This is probably going to be more worse than disappointing. I found this list honestly pretty easy to make. It's 10 books total, but the scale is going to work sort of starting with disappointing, working our way to worst. So without further ado, let's get into it. And just again, I want to remind you, these first few books aren't bad. They were just disappointing for ways that I'm going to get into. So let's have some fun. Just so we're clear, it's not the books behind me. I just happen to have some books out, and I feel like people are more likely to watch a video if there are books behind someone. Well, they're talking about books. Okay, up for number one. I'm going to start with The Ecstatic by Victor LaValle, because again, I would never say Victor LaValle's book is bad. Well, at least I've yet to say that, and I'm about to start now. This is the first time I haven't really loved a book, and so by that standard, it's easy to see why, if I don't like this one, it's easy to see why I'd be disappointed, because every time I go into his book, I always worry that it might be a little too literary, a little too highbrow in the type of fiction he writes. It never is. It's usually a nice balance of compelling and also very thought-provoking horror. And this is thought-provoking horror, but it is very intentional in being absurdist fiction. It is written from the perspective of someone who I believe has schizophrenia. He is from a poor family. He is a young black boy, or a man, I guess. He's like 23, I think. He's just trying to get by, and the thing is, we're seeing the world from his perspective, and it's basically him trying to go to school, go through work, and go through family, but because he is schizophrenic, we basically see his perspective in this surreal, absurdist way that is honestly just not the easiest to get through. And I read this through like an ebook that was text-to-speech, and while those have gotten better, this can only go so far, and it's especially hard when what we're reading is intentionally hard to parse. And I'm not even sure this was like an official professional audio production to make a difference, because at the end of the day, this book was just really hard to get through, really hard to get invested in. But intellectually, it's like a really intriguing way of writing a book, of studying this man's life in a way that is uncomfortable and confusing, but still, I think, a well-produced horror book. I can admire horror books like this and say they are good in their own way, but for me, I didn't love it. And more than that, because I've only ever loved Victor LaValle's books, that not loving this one is an inherently just a disappointing read. Now, up next to the next one, we'll say Autocracy Incorporated by Anne Applebaum. I think this is a nonfiction. I have, I think, 4 and 6 in terms of nonfiction to fiction ratio. I tried to parse it between each two, go back and forth between them. This is a book that is fairly recent, a publication about the nature in which autocracies work and arise. And it's interesting, compelling, and very relevant to the time, and I think it's still worth reading, honestly, given where we're at in America, in the world, to be honest. My issue with this book was that I felt like there was a lot that could have been said as an analysis of this topic throughout history, pulling on topics and situations that are beyond just the present moment, and instead what it was really was a analysis of autocracies in the present years, or in the present decade or so. And in my opinion, I just feel like it wasn't as compelling for that reason, and honestly it was just inherently disappointing, as I really had high hopes for this. Usually a political book, especially one that talks about this type of topic, is easy for me to get invested in. It's just a topic that I get really lost in. Like lost in a good way, or immersed, I guess is a better word. And this one, instead, because it focused really just on like a Russia-Ukraine war, or the wars in Syria, just like recent conflicts, it just felt extremely present, and it felt like this book isn't really going to stand the test of time, because it's very much appealing to the most recent situations that are going on, when autocracies aren't new. And I feel like that should have been a larger conversation. I think the present moment is a good context by which to place us, but I think, first off, the discussion could have been larger, could have been bigger analysis of history, I think, and it wasn't that. And so I was just, like I said, disappointed. I can't say it was particularly bad. Like, for me, I didn't love it because I was wanting something else, but in terms of what it's trying to do, I think it still has plenty of compelling things to say about, well, the world and, frankly, Trump's America. Okay, number 3, Einstein's Dreams. And this one, I think it's with Alan Lightman or something, was definitely one of the biggest disappointments. These first 3 could so easily be just shuffled around, honestly. Now that I think about it, this one might have been my biggest disappointment, because I had such high hopes for this. This sort of book that is, I think, is presented as the dreams of Einstein, and we have these sort of speculative situations that are sort of all revolving around the type of philosophical and scientific musings, or rather findings of Einstein and cosmology, and the things that he did. And that's something that I just love. And from a scientific perspective, which I think this guy is a scientist, if you could like find the right balance of science and a speculative fun, there's just so much potential for me, and I think I could really, really love this. And I think the problem I have this, based off the reading my review, because it's been a while, was that I just didn't hit as hard as I thought it would be. It wasn't as compelling. The worlds didn't feel as realized, and ultimately, I think I lifted this book too high in my mind. I expected too much of it. It just didn't work for me. It's in the same vein, I think, as someone like Ted Chiang, who is trying to do serious philosophical musings of speculative ideas, but it definitely doesn't hit as hard or as effectively as Ted Chiang. And I'll go into spoiler, he'll be on one of these other lists, not today, but he'll be on one of my lists in this sort of closing out the year. I say he, being Ted Chiang, because he knows how to make a speculative concept work in a very philosophically compelling way, in a very compact way. And that's not what we get here. And I must say, it was just the most disappointing book, even though I'm realizing now it should have been higher up. It was just, I had such high hopes, and I'm disappointed it didn't work out, especially since it was a backlist. It was on my backlist TBR. Now up to books that are going between disappointing and worst, really, which is to say Miss Kennedy by Elizabeth something, I think I don't remember her name, but the cover will be here. This is a nonfiction biography about Jacqueline Kennedy, and what was disappointing about this was that the writing, the storytelling it was perfect. It's what I love in a biography. It's exactly what I want from biography, to be honest, and it was so compelling. It's the kind of book you start reading and you think this is the kind of book that could be a 5-star, and you know it's going to be that. But then the more and more we went through it, the more infuriated I became because of the way in which the author, not Applebaum, frames or analyzes Jackie's life. And really my problem was that it felt like fundamentally misogynistic and patriarchal, the way she looked at Jackie's life from the perspective of her as a cheated on woman, her as a mother, her as someone who struggles emotionally, and it just all evolved around these things that just feel so stereotypically misogynist and sort of really, I think, overly boiling someone down to their identity as a woman rather than who they were as a bigger person. And it was just that discussion and the obsession, really, I think, on how she felt every time she got cheated on, and how emotional she got and had to work with it, that it's felt to me just so twisted. And it's this way that's almost subtle, in a way that I think you could, like, the book is still compelling. It's so compelling, and I think it's easy to feel bad for Jacqueline and feel like this book is not shit-talking her, but in a way it does. It feels so condescending, the way it's framed. And I was just so infuriated. I got, I think, an arc of this. It was an audio adaptation, and the audio is fine, but damn, is the book not worth reading. It was not worth an upgrade, in my opinion. And I have a whole review of this, actually, you can check out if you're interested. Now going back to fiction, number 5, Fried Green Tomatoes. Now this was a reread. I don't generally put on rereads on this list, but this is a special circumstance. I think I'll talk about this in my updated Golden Girls book tag, which you should check out. I really loved playing that video, honestly. And it's because I have this feeling of this book as sort of a reminiscent of my childhood, or sort of nostalgia to where I come from, the area that I come from. Well, I think that still very much applies. It's also easy to see why, because there's just so much, the way it treats race, honestly, is just really uncomfortable. I think it's one of those faux progressive natures where they try to be respectful while simultaneously be condescending or demeaning, almost in the same way as Miss Kennedy was, from a misogynistic way. This is from a racist perspective, because you have this sort of white woman, this white author, trying to talk about, the good ones and how the way they get hurt, or rather the simplification of certain black people in a way that is demeaning and dehumanizing, honestly, just the way you sort of take away their own identity, their own intelligence, their own ability just to exist without being just this innocent victim, or this weird construct of what she frames it. And really, at the end of the day, it's one of those things where, like, racism is presented as a problem that is, what's the word I'm looking for? It's so hard to remember everything I said in my written review, which I'm pretty sure you can check out my Goodreads for that. But it's basically trying to say that, present this idea of racism is just, this pesky problem we have to get rid of. It's not a pervasive problem. It's just a few bad apples of white people who happen to be really bad, just to have that one, bad flaw about them. And it's just this way of sugarcoating racism, and of course, I think undermining or ignoring how pervasive it is and how persistent it is, even among those who consider themselves progressive or supportive, when really this is more like they're just tolerating and not a lot of self-reflection. It's just this perfect, I think, embodiment of the South and the Southern mindset of the South, white South, white Southerners, and the way they think about race and just the atmosphere around race and the history of race in the South. And so in that way, it's like a really fascinating juxtaposition of an interesting moment in time that is so uncomfortable to read. But at the same time, it's just disappointing to find out that it wasn't as great as I remembered it, while also just being honestly objectively bad because of just where it sits in time and how it sort of finds itself stuck in the bad parts of its time. Now up to number 6, we're really in the depths of the worst now. Number 6, we have The Shape of Life, a nonfiction biography, science, written by and about a mathematician, a scientist who I just didn't like. In academia, you have certain types, especially people who get positions of power, who are selfish and frankly assholes, narcissistic, who will beat down on people beneath them, especially when it comes to like grad students, and use their power in that way. And this guy, came across that way as someone who very much just is kind of an asshole academic, kind of like the worst of the worst in academia. Like that mindset is pervasive. Not like he's not like a caricature villain. He's just this representation of everything that's wrong with academia, people in positions of power, thinking that gives them the right to treat people like shit, and then act like they don't know what they're talking about, act all innocent. And part of it is like this, the way in which he talks about his life, and he tries to present himself in a way that is humble and not boasting, but like it's like this thing, well, I never thought it was that great, but I did win this massive, very prestigious award. And then also things like when he talks about his family, it almost feels like a passing thought, like, oh, this is where I actually mention my family, but it doesn't feel very, like it's very significant. Like we don't mention it, he doesn't mention his brother at all until he dies, and it's like, oh, I had some wonderful relationship with my brother who, by chance, it wasn't worth a single moment thought in my life or in this discussion of my life until he died. And same with his wife, she seemed only relevant when it came to the marriage and the birth of the kids. And then you have because all this is existing around basically his discussion of his academic life. And when he talks about his academic life, there are so many times where he seems to find himself in uncomfortable situations of basically conflicts, of social conflicts, of someone thinking he did a shitty thing, or there was a disagreement on who was the asshole here. And somehow it's always the person's fault. And oftentimes, at least one time, it was someone who was lower than him, like a postdoc that he had hired, who he found a way of demeaning in a way that was also simultaneously demeaning to the grad students, or the students that he actually hired, besides the postgraduate, which is to say, not even the undergrads, or the grad students respected him in a way that is demeaning both to him and to grad students, to say even these basically allude to them in this sort of pathetic, lowly way. And it's just this, it's all comes together to make this just disgusting and honestly, frankly, bad an analysis. And I just really hate this book because of just not liking him, and also just because of the way in which it tries to present this picture of himself in a way that is just not done well. I think it's very transparent to those who know. Hopefully that wasn't too much of a discussion of that, because I feel like people don't care about these obscure books, but maybe you do. Maybe you enjoy hearing the tea about books that you have interest in reading. That can be fun, speaking as someone who enjoys watching that kind of content. Okay, now up to number 7, Hellbound Hearts, an anthology of horror stories set in the world of Hellraiser, Cenobites, angels to some, demons to others, or the way around. And ultimately, this really just makes, I don't know, it just wasn't good. A lot of the stories were bad. Some of the stories really lent into some of the depraved parts of Hellraiser in a way that I felt like was almost worshipping some not good things. Like I understand worship, like this idea of pain and this sort of hell, like sort of being like sort of infantilizing hell in a way. But when you start infantilizing certain types of people in a way that's sort of obsessing of them in text, it starts to feel less like a critique or less like an analysis, or more like just say, like you're reveling in some of these disgusting actions in a way that, and you realize maybe there's a limit to what this world can have, what you can do to this world without it being problematic. Or maybe it's just that this world, while there is an interesting, I think, not problematic side to it, will also pull in certain problematic people who will then take it in that direction that I'm not comfortable with. That's probably the best I've described it yet. I'm not sure if it was very clear. Like, I'm not trying to say like I'm triggered, because I'm not, but they were just ways in which it was reveling in some of the disgusting parts of human nature that I felt like just was not what I liked about this series, because I really just like the demons and the sort of fixation on pain and what's the line between pain and pleasure. And I love the mythos of this, especially as someone who raised Christian. And ultimately it was just disappointing, because it wasn't just those stories. It was a bunch of mediocre stories that just weren't that great. Some were fine and interesting, but it's just easy to say you really shouldn't bother. Like I've read now, I think this is the second book that I've read that was continuing the mythos, and they've all been bad. I would say to stick with the original novella and go with it, Hellbound Heart. Now on to number 8. We are at, I think, our last nonfiction, and this is A History of Korea, which I was looking for a book that talked about Korea and its history from the perspective of a own voices writer, because there are so many that are written by Americans, or from the American perspective. And this was a very widespread, rather wide encompassing historical accounting of Korea from like before actually Korea was founded to like the ancient times. Ancient history is what I'm trying to say here. And in some way it's intriguing, and it's not necessarily badly written. I think it's just the way in which he tells the story in a very compact, like 300-ish lengths of decades or centuries or thousands of years, that I felt like just wasn't effective. I didn't think he was effectively communicating the narrative. In short, he would like spend a few decades in each chapter. He would start the chapter off with summaries of what happens in those times, listing events and names, and then just go through it. And it ended up reading or feeling like I was reading an encyclopedia. Like we spent so much time really talking about the workings of what's going on and going through so many names, so many dates, that nothing really sunk in. There was nothing to really ground us. And it ultimately felt like something, the level of detail I could have ascertained if I just read the history of Korea from Wikipedia. That's the level of detail I would remember reading through all of this. It just wasn't an effective way of communicating. And in some ways that's personal. And maybe this does deserve to be more disappointed. It's particularly bad, but I think it is. As a work of history, it's just not well written because of the way it just, one, with the outline of everything was just very tedious and not helpful, especially since it was at the beginning of a chapter instead of the end to summarize. And just the way in which he didn't really give us a thread to help us understand who these people are. We're going from one name to another, who I don't know who's who, or what happened to who, or where this thing happened to this person, but again, where does he fit into the arc again? Because I'm just lost. And perhaps it's wrong with me to expect more of this book. Or maybe this is the type of narrative that just needs more time. Maybe it needs to be more encyclopedic, which is to say, maybe it needs to be more textbook, more wide-reaching. Because ultimately, it's spending too little time in each time period for any of it to really sink in my opinion. Okay, now the number 9. One of the worst books I have ever read. And a book that I think I DNF'd, but honestly I do not remember anymore because I got pretty damn far. No, I think I actually finished it. Did I mark it as DNF? The Witching Hour by Anne Rice. And this is the second time I tried reading this. The first time was a while back, and ultimately when I started this time, I found it more compelling. Let's say a while back, like several years before book 2. I found it compelling and easy enough to get through, which was sort of the goal. I wanted a backlist book that was fun, that wasn't just a reread, because I have a habit of rereading Stephen King when I'm in a down, and I just want something easy. And I figured, why not something easy that's new, to expand my palette. And what I hate about this was that the way it was told, one, it was so long, unnecessarily long. It follows this woman who's part of this family of witches, and they have this mystery of where their magic come from, and what is this entity / ghost that seems to be following them, that may or may not be giving them the power. It's not clear. Who also is the father of the ghost, is like a father of a lot of the witches, but also actively seeking out to fornicate with and marry, have sex with these children of his. And it's like a lot of weird incest, which is definitely something Anne Rice was into. She had like really intense erotica fiction, if you don't know about that, and it's sort of very much apparent here. So it's like that uncomfortable side there, but really it's more than just being uncomfortable with incest. It's the way in which the story is told, from the idea she wants to explore to the sort of the way she's telling history. A lot of it's flashback, or a big chunk of the book, like a solid fourth of it, I think, or a third, is someone sitting down reading a book about the history of this family and learning about it, and it was just so dull. I felt like so much of that could have just been summarized in a conversation rather than exposition as a big part of the book itself. It was just so fucking long, 1,000+ pages. And ultimately, when the book ended, it did something that I did not expect, which I guess is to its benefit, but really it left off like cliffhanger. And that's my biggest like shit that I hate. It was because I spent all this time, because as much as I wasn't enjoying a lot of it, I was still interested in the world. I wanted to understand what would happen. And this shit happens. It wasn't what I was expecting in a bad way. And I don't know what's going to happen. I have to read the next book, and I don't think I will. I'll probably read Wikipedia, but fuck did I get pissed at this book. I was so pissed at this book. I just did not like it. It was too long, and it was just a slog when I was going for something easy. And ultimately I pushed through. For why? I don't know. Don't ask me. Okay, now on to number 10. A book that probably wouldn't make me quite as angry. The angriest books of 2024. That's what I should have done. Be a different list. But a book that I still think is the worst, and that is Doctor Strange, Dimension War. And this really has turned me off to trying Marvel fiction, let's just say Marvel-based fiction, because I thought, this will be an easy book. I like Doctor Strange, I like magic, and it should just be an easy, fun read. Come to find out, this book is basically an adaptation of a comic, and talk about someone like an author putting in the minimum amount of effort, because fuck did he not put in any effort in trying to adapt a a comic-based story into an actual narrative. Think about how a comic has a situation and has a bunch of exposition. So that's what this is. Oh, such and such says this, such and such does this, such and such does that. And it's just this really poorly written, and it's also really cheesy dialogue. It's just really fucking bad. It's just objectively one of the worst things I've ever read. I DNF'd it like maybe up to 20 or 30%, just because it was very clear what it was. And what I hate about it isn't that it was just dumb fiction. It's just that it feels like this author just was given money by Marvel to do the minimal amount of effort into something that could have just been such an easy, fun read, because you wanted to adapt something without changing too much. And you have to acknowledge, if you're going to adapt something to anything, each format requires different things of the story, and sometimes that means you have to change it. And this one didn't do that. It was just so badly written, badly told, and just a bad story overall. I can get by a bad story if it's at least compelling and fun, but it is not that. It is just so fucking bad. And honestly, I am mad. More so, but I'm mad that it wasted my goddamn time, and that it's now turned me off to reading more Marvel books. There's one by Sean McGuire that I want to read, but I'm just so hesitant. I don't know, is it going to be just as bad? Am I going to really hate a book by Sean McGuire for the first time in my life? I don't know. I think it's just this one guy. An example of, again, Marvel or studios giving money to mediocre white men doing trash work. Anyways, that's it. Those are the worst books and just the most disappointing books of 2024, or at least the 10 most of them. Not a hard list to make, honestly. This I think was a decent list. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I know some of them probably more obscure, a lot of them not necessarily in the mind of a lot of booktube right now, but I've enjoyed it. I'm a little niche, hopefully, and hopefully you enjoyed it as well. And I hope you have a great day, stay safe, and I'll see you next time on Josh's Bookish Voyage.